Sam and Sebastian with us, who actually need no introduction. They are very famous. So let me hand over them for their introduction and the presentation. Hand over to you.
Okay, good, wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody, and thanks for joining us in our walkthrough session, or how Sam and I would like to call it, our discourse on the ultimate CTA diagramming framework. Now, what our goal is for today is help you understand the purpose of that framework and how you can utilize it, not only for your journey to CTA, but really how you can use it for your overall architecture practice in engagements with your customers. Before we start doing that, however, Sam, do you mind giving a quick introduction of yourself so those that are not yet familiar with you know who is joining me today?
Absolutely, yeah. So hello everybody out there in the wild. My name's Sam Wadwani. I'm a Salesforce CTA, and I'm Chief Architect for PwC UK. I also sort of co-founded the Architect Dreaming conference events that some of you may have been part of. I'm one of the mentors through the Scale Up Architects program for underserved architects, and I lead our London Trailblazer Architect group in the UK as well.
Okay, good, excellent, Sam. Thank you very much. Now, the way of how we're going to run this session is pretty much a dialogue or a conversation between Sam and me, where each of us will be focusing on different diagrams and will inquire inputs and viewpoints from the other person. Now, Amit, I have a question. Do we have any chance of receiving questions from the audience?
Yep. Whenever you will get a question, I will be flash on the screen.
Okay, good, because I have that on a different screen.
Yep.
So if we don't necessarily respond, it would be helpful if you could bring this to our attention. In regards to the questions themselves, Sam, I think what makes the most sense for us is we will address questions that are specific to what we're talking about in the moment, or if not, we will actually bring it up and say when we will address it, and that will be most likely towards the end of the session. Okay, good, wonderful. So let's quickly talk about what gave birth to this framework. So as you are aware, Salesforce has recently introduced some changes to the exam in the sense of no longer allowing hand-drawn diagrams, but enforcing now the use of lucid chart diagrams. And as a response to that, what I have decided, or like what Sam and me have decided, is to come up with a framework that will provide you with the necessary guidance of how to produce those artifacts, while at the same time kind of taking out all the guesswork. So we've gone through this framework, and we've tried to actually create something that allows you to quickly and rapidly generate those diagrams that aid your thought process while reducing the number of clicks and the cognitive load for you as well as the judges. Now, what we're putting forward is a suggestion for you. It works, but you need to make this work for yourself. And maybe, Sam, you can share a couple of your thoughts on how to adopt this framework in general and what people should look out for when they're adopting it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we're all individuals at the end of the day, and each of us is going through the CTA journey and our architect, professional journeys, with different influences, different experiences, and so on. We also communicate in very different ways, and what we're talking about here in CTA diagramming is a way of helping you communicate what is otherwise complex solutions in a simple and concise way, but that doesn't take away that individuality, and so you still need to look at what is your communication style, what's your comfort level, and how are you going to use this framework to form your own style and to be most effective in for that purpose.
Exactly. And I think one important aspect is when it really comes down to figuring things out, try to avoid adding more complexity. So for instance, we've decided not to use any kind of icons or any kind of colors. because we wanted to reduce the number of clicks that are necessary to produce that. Now, if you feel like for your storytelling or for better depiction, colors make sense, sure, go and test it out, but you probably don't want to end up with like a bouquet of rainbow colors that just make it more complicated for you to produce. One other thing that I would just like to highlight is this is an evolutionary framework. So as we receive feedback from individuals, we will be bumping up the version number. So always keep a reference to this document. You can go to flowrepublic.com CTA diagrams. We've created like a very basic newsletter where we will be sharing updates, and we will be posting that on LinkedIn as well so that you don't miss anything. Okay, cool. Now, I would suggest let's have a quick look into the storytelling aspect. And Sam, how about you take us through the storytelling aspects and how the framework or the diagrams that are presented here can be utilized?
Sure, absolutely. So, first of all, brace yourselves. I'm here to give you the truth, and I'm going to debunk some of the myths and anti-patterns about the review board exam a little bit. Okay, so number one, the creating artifacts in the CTA review board is not a tick box exercise. Okay, judges aren't marking off a scorecard or a tick sheet whether you've got specific artifacts or not. Okay, but you may have heard the phrase, a picture paints 1,000 words. So what is expected is that in order to explain the complexities and the considerations and the trade-offs in your choices, you will need some visual aids to assist. Okay, the judges are acting as if they're C-suite but technically focused executives, and they're looking to understand the end-to-end journey that they're about to embark on. Okay, but storytelling is a skill that's effective in describing the transformation journey that they're going through, but it shouldn't be at the cost of the detail. Okay, visual articulations of the solution allow you to balance that narrative with the detail. One of the anti-patterns that results in poor clarity is presenting the artifacts as they are. So you're showing on a screen, and I mean by just pointing at parts of the diagram and saying what is written in the artifact. That isn't helpful. So please don't do it. Rather, you need to explain what the artifact is showing and impacts of it. It also makes it very difficult when you do that to bridge between chapters in the story. Okay, so in this journey, we're using the artifacts to explain the vision and the purpose of the business and the environment within which they're operating. Then we use users and licenses or role hierarchies to frame who and what parts of the company are affected and how. Okay, moving on to where is that change in the overall technology landscape underpinned? Okay, and that's your system landscape. And in doing so, what is the data that we're dealing with? How does it help the processes, and what are the risks and impacts that they introduce? And then finally, how do we transform to that solution via migration or some sort of rollout path? And then how are the technical teams going to deliver it through the environment strategy or the DevOps? And then finally, how will the business govern the decision making and change process? That then provides you with your end-to-end story of of how you're gonna get there.
Cool. Okay, wonderful. Maybe just a quick remark. Except for the user and licenses, every blue box that you can see here is somewhat represented in the framework, but there's one that is missing. And Sam, where do you see the authentication diagram, the SSO flow, fitting into this storyline?
Yeah, so if you think about the single sign-on flows, and there's many of those, and we'll talk about them in a little while, but what you're describing with that artifact is how do your users, whether they be external or internal, authenticate themselves in order to access functionality. So one thing that isn't in this journey actually is the solution architecture section. Now, actually, when you think about the journey from start to finish, a story doesn't start with immediately going into the detail. It always starts with some framing, some context, and then as you go through the story, you delve more into the detail, and it becomes more and more complicated. The single sign-on flow is part and parcel of a step in a process. Okay, typically it's a technical element, and therefore, in my view, sits within the an element of the solution architecture step. Okay, so it's somewhere in the middle because it's very detailed, but it's explaining a very specific part of the process.
Good. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for that. Now, before we go into the specific diagrams, I would just like to bring your attention to one page in here, which is the template shape library. So as we will be going through the different diagrams, you will always see the template shapes that we have used here. And we've created like a consolidated page for you where you can find all of those. And here are a couple of things that you need to keep in mind. So first of all, what we are attempting to do is we are trying to standardize the shapes that we're using. So instead of using 50 different types of shapes, we're fundamentally relying on 2 different ones or 3 different ones. The first one being a rectangle and the other one being a line. And those shapes simply differ in regards to formatting in terms of, is it bold, what's the font size, etc., so that it becomes relatively easy for you to create from scratch as you are solving your scenario, because at the end of the day, for the exam, you can't come in with like the predefined template library, but you have to create everything from scratch. The other thing that we have opted in for is using standardized sizing. So we have 2 different units of measurement that we're using. One is a block. So if you look at the grid here, you can see a square form, which we call a block. And they are normally following like a standard sizing. Here in this case, it's 1.59 centimeters because I'm living in Europe, I'm using the metric units. In the US, it will be slightly different, and it depends really on the local settings of your account. Okay, and that means really that you need to check it out and figure out what defines a block. Okay, and we're using the concept of a cell. So a block is normally 5 cells wide and 5 cells high, and 1 cell is 0.32 centimeters. Again, go play around. And the reason why we are providing those exact measures is because we've been playing around a little bit, and we realized once you actually change the zoom, the size of a block changes. So around 35%, what you can see here, a block is no longer a block, but it's actually 3 cells on this V-size grid, okay? Which is why be mindful, test it out, and make sure that you're following those guidelines, because what we have done is we have defined the framework so that you can have all diagrams fit onto a 13-inch screen with the appropriate resolution. So if you look at the system landscape, it's a rather large one. Okay, give me 1 second. Mia, more. Yeah, sorry, my dog is going a little bit crazy. So it all fits on a single page. You don't need to resize. You don't need to scroll around, and that's really the reason why we have defined those. What you can also see is we don't use any predefined shapes that are coming from other frameworks. And Sam, maybe you can give us a quick rationale for that and how this compares to other ones.
Yeah, so certainly within the Salesforce world, you've got your standard shapes, your rectangles, your basic, primitive shapes, if you will, squares, triangles, circles, and all that sort of stuff. You've also then got the Salesforce diagram shapes as well. So you're looking at cards with or without icons, with or without attributes, and so on. Now, typically, whenever us as Salesforce architects are looking to describe an artifact or describe a concept, we're looking at one of those 2 things. And these days, it's becoming increasingly popular to and best practice to use the Salesforce diagrams. So with your client engagements, of course, use Salesforce diagrams, okay, because it provides a standardized syntax or language and a way of doing it. However, there's a lot of space taken up by those cards, both around the edges and inside. if you can fit everything in, by all means, use the Salesforce diagrams, okay? But if you're struggling for space and you're finding that with your Zoom level or whatever it is, you're having to scroll around a document too much, then it may be better for you to use more of the CTA framework.
Yeah.
In non-CTA situations, architects tend to also use UML. And what we're showing here is that there's an equivalency between using the CTA framework shapes, which are based on the primitive ones, the UML standard lucid shapes, which you won't get access to in the CTA board, and then the Salesforce diagrams ones that you will get access to as well. Okay. So it's up to you which one you use, but just be mindful of the sort of form factor and space requirements that each of those provide. But there is an equivalency.
Okay, good. So maybe just for context, if you look at the Salesforce diagram shape for system, I'm simply copy pasting this and I'm laying this over. What you can see here is what constitutes two boxes in this framework constitutes a single box within the Salesforce framework. Now, while fundamentally you can make this work, for us, the rationale was really we want to convey as much information as possible on a single view without you having to navigate around. But as Sam said, by all means, if you prefer the other one, we're not going to tell you otherwise. So the way you can treat this framework is also on a almost like a form of guidance of how to arrange your diagrams, what's the information to convey, and then at the end of the day, you decide what shapes you want to use for it. Okay, so nobody's going to hold you responsible if you're using the shapes that we have defined, your own ones or the Salesforce ones. Okay, good, and I think that actually gives us a good introduction into the different diagrams. So let's start with the role hierarchy. Sam, can you maybe take us through here, please?
Yeah, sure. So, so what we're talking about in the role hierarchy is how the various different visibility levels of user groups are going to be organized. Okay. And generally, it fits into two ways of describing that. Number one is in a sort of a very tree-based hierarchy, but text-based. Okay, so it's using a lot of indentations, it's using multiple lines, things like that. And the trade-off between this and the other one below, which is slightly more visual, is speed, really, speed and clarity. So it's very, most people type in their day-to-day jobs, and it's very quick to type and indent at the same time. It's very easy to copy and paste. It's all keystrokes. However, it is a little bit more difficult to understand how the levels interplay when you've got a textual structure like that. Now, it's eminently more clear to be able to see how they relate to each other in more of the hierarchy view underneath, which is more visual. However, it takes a little bit more time to construct, and it takes a little bit more to adapt. That's not to say you can't do it. You can still copy and paste. You can click and drag, but just in terms of you got to use the approach that works most efficiently for you, but don't compromise that clarity.
Okay, Sam, what's your approach?
My approach is the visual one at the bottom most of the time, but I tend to start with the indented one, just to get some of the key points, and then quickly move on to the latter.
Yeah, exactly. So given my German nature, I opt for the indented one, simply for the speed of it and the ability to convey the same information. But clearly, yours is definitely easier to comprehend on a single view. So really test it out, see what resonates the most with you. What we also have included here as a reference is a territory hierarchy, for which the role hierarchy slide is probably a good location, but don't go crazy. The job here is to just exemplify how the territory model will be used and ultimately extend the role hierarchy model that you're using. Okay, good. By the way, like what you can see here is we have included different nodes and of different colors. In this case, it's just the yellow one with some additional guidance and comments that you can use. And with that being said, let's move on into the system landscape. So first of all, everybody can take a deep breath, because this is not the size and the level of complexity of a system architecture diagram that you will have to produce for the exam. However, this is more like a reference architecture diagram with the variety of different systems and use cases that you have to cover or that you will have to cover in your exam. And the intent is for it to act more like a blueprint in regards to how are you going to arrange those different system components. Now, for instance, if you were only to have a single mobile application, you would only create a single block for it instead of recreating this entire diagram from scratch and then filling it out. So it's more a blueprint, you have it in your mind, and you can then start filling in the blanks. As to what's the most efficient way, I think our general suggestion would be start with an outline, start with the building blocks that are going to be in there 100%. That would be like Salesforce, different communities. There would be ESB or middleware components, possible legacy systems that you're identifying as you go, and then filling out the rest as you go. Okay. What I have included here, just for your reference, so you can see it, is we're trying to create different sectors or drop zones, if you want, for different systems. So for instance, on the top area, we always have the customer or the experience applications or that layer. We have different common applications, primarily backend systems that we're dealing with. Okay? And that really makes it easy for you to start producing those artifacts because there is less guesswork and you can really focus on the solutioning aspects in general. Okay. As for the integrations, I think there is an eternal debate on what's the level of detail to convey in the system architecture diagram. And what I would suggest is treat this as a 30,000 foot view on how's this application, how's your solution going to work, how's it going to incorporate different system components, and what's the kind of data and the processes that you integrating across those systems and components without getting lost in the details. So for instance, if you have the ERP system in the backend, what is the kind of data that you're exchanging between Salesforce and the ERP without getting lost in low-level details? I'm going to use a platform event to send the order ID to the ESP to pick it up, and then the ESP is going to make a remote call in. You know, those are the kind of low-level details that make it really hard to follow your presentation because you're now mixing high-level with low-level details, making it really hard to comprehend. Assuming that you will have like a place within your presentation later where you're covering those details sufficiently. Okay. Also, the eternal debates that we always have around firewalls. So, Sam, what's your take on including the firewall here?
So I remember when I was going through my CTA journey that we had this debate so many times. It happens, it happens all the time. So my personal view, and I guess in a way it sort of exemplifies how this is a model, a framework for you to adapt to what you want to, how you want to use it and how you want to describe the impacts. So I would normally include a firewall, which is just one, red dotted or dashed line, and it could be not just a straight line, it could be an elbowed line or something like that. But and the intention to do that is to explain where the boundaries of control are, in my personal view. Also, where there's infrastructure change as well that may not necessarily otherwise be called out. That's my personal way of doing it. Others may not do that. They might want to talk about it implicitly within a system that where the risks of infrastructure change are impacting their particularly. So it really is horses for courses and up to your individual communication style.
What horses for courses? I have never heard that expression. What does that mean?
It means sometimes one horse may not be equipped or best suited for a particular course or path. Yeah.
Okay, good, wonderful. Maybe one important aspect, since we see here a lot of connections and lines, so you might be you might find yourself in a situation where you want to prettify all of those lines. Okay, do yourself a favor, really do this towards the end of your diagramming, and use this concept. So what is it called again? Um, no, not the
Keystrokes,
keystrokes,
shortcut
the
keystrokes.
reset line
Oh,
feature.
oh,
So
reset
instead of
line. Yeah.
manually
Yeah.
moving lines around, really make yourself familiar with the onboard functionalities such as reset line to kind of straighten those lines and make them easier. But also in the template shape library, courtesy of Sam, we have a bunch of different keystrokes or shortcut keys that you can use, then really make it significantly easier. And I think if you're pressed for time, this is definitely one way of how you can accelerate that. Okay, wonderful. I mean, do we have any questions?
A couple of points, if I
Yes, please.
could also, a couple of points, if I could also add, is that what we're showing here is that this is a reference model that you can use. Please don't take it as a set of instructions as to this is how you need to draw your diagram. This is a way of laying out systems. And what, what we expect to see, what we
Yeah.
tend to see, is that every scenario is different, and therefore, if for example, tried to put one of the systems on the left, but it's got a connection over to a system on the right, does it make sense to put it on the left anymore? Because then you're going to have lines crossing over all over the place. Use your own judgment, but this gives you what I would say is an early mental picture of what your landscape might
Yeah.
look like, so that when you're then drawing it, it's very quick and easy for you to know, okay, well, I'm going to put these here, those there, and it just speeds up your cognitive load.
On that topic, I'm already seeing with some of my clients those diagrams popping up, and as you can see, like this is not an exact recreation of what we're putting forward, but it kind of goes in a similar direction, you know.
Yeah.
And that's really what this is about, like standardizing and giving you some guidance, but you use it in the best way that it fits your requirements.
I think we did have a
Yes.
question. Sorry, what was that on? Yeah. Where does the business process flow diagram fit into the artifacts that was proposed?
None of us is suggesting that. So Sam, what's your take on a business process flow diagram for the exam?
So it would be fantastic to have a full complement set of typical architectural artifacts to produce and present in the review board exam. However, time is against you, sort of thing. So you have to really think about specifically which artifacts are providing the most impact in your storytelling and how you're going to explain the solution. Now, typical scenarios involve a set of paragraphs, if you will, that are describing the business process. So you're likely to want to, especially in the solution design explanation of your solution design, you're likely to want to talk through the process in order to explain how the Salesforce platform features on platform, off platform, and the complexities around code, programmatic versus declarative changes you're going to use to satisfy them. But then if you're doing that is a business process and the time taken to build a business process the most effective use of your time, great if you can, if you're quick about doing it, but the scenarios are complex. So it's up to you. I personally found that it was time I didn't have, but I could through the storytelling explain the business processes instead. So that was my personal take.
Yeah, I think also having seen a significant amount of diagrams, the process flow diagrams would tend to be rather basic. Like there's not much complexity. You maybe have like 3 swim lanes. You have like, I don't know, making numbers up now, but like maybe 8 boxes with activities, with a low degree of dependencies. And that is something, if you really need a visual representation of that process, you can also just go with like a list, where you're using a smart way of formatting that. And there is a UML markup language, which I can't really remember on top of my head, but there's like a markup that allows you to generate a sequence diagram in UML, and you can use a structure or like a format such as this to at least textually represent that flow, if it's really needed.
Yeah, so I totally agree, but just be mindful that you don't want to spend a lot of your time debugging code at the same time.
Sure.
Again, it comes down to
Yeah.
time. You've got to be as efficient as possible. So again, if you're really quick at it and you're very accurate at it, then by all means use it. But if it means you're going to burn time, then it's probably not an effective use to produce it.
Exactly. And I mean, so in my work, in a lot of cases, I have people telling me, I need this, I absolutely need this. And I will tell them, no, you don't need this. But you just think you need it, and they have to force themselves dealing with, or like presenting those solutions, solving those scenarios without those diagrams. And it's a matter of practice, yes, it's not comfortable to have, or like to lack that visual support, but it's doable. So don't look for excuses. Okay, wonderful. So we had the role hierarchy, we had the system landscape. So now from the big picture view, let's have a look into the lower detailed view. And Sam, would you give us the honor and walking us through this END?
Yeah. So in essence, if you think about what are we trying to convey in this artifact, we're trying to convey what are the business entities that are represented by objects in our implementation, and how are they used? How are they used? What are the impacts? How are they related to each other? Now, again, going back to the previous point and about business process diagrams and the ERD, what we're not trying to do is simply say, and here's a box that represents this object, and basically reading off the diagram. That's not actually helping. But what is actually helping is the fact that you're saying, perhaps the install base that the customers will have is represented by an asset object. That doesn't have the same storage limits that other objects do. Hence my choice. But it is a large volume of data, and therefore there's these risks. So you've marked out specifically some of those aspects on the diagram by saying, that this is an asset object, it's owned by so and so, its security org-wide default is X, it is or isn't large data volumes, this is the volume I expect, and therefore I can talk to the risks and impacts of that choice. Now there are some differences of opinion, I guess, about how to do that. Some people talk about using colors quite a lot. As we said at the very beginning, to demonstrate the difference between standard objects, custom objects, and so on. You can do that if you've got time and you're comfortable with that. By all means, do it. For those of us who are more, quickest typing, you might want to consider, as we've got here, just using the normal notation of _C for custom, _X for external, and so on and so forth. Okay. Similarly, there's also different schools of thought around those elements of ownership, OWD, and large data volumes. Should those be rows of attributes down below, much like you've got with the standard Salesforce cards right there? What you'll notice, though, is that there's additional clicks in order to manage those attributes, add more attributes, remove attributes, and obviously it takes up more and more space. So again, find which way works for you. What we've shown here is a single line representation of the same. Of course, you then need a little bit more explanation to pick out the details. but it's a lot quicker to produce, and then it comes down to your narrative on top. The other thing to note is that crow's feet notation. So again, people tend to use different styles, and I've seen before people using diamonds, circles, arrows. Arrows are, in my view, very confusing, because it denotes some form of direction, but doesn't necessarily clearly explain the cardinality. So all of those, I think, go with the standard, which is crow's feet. It's very explicit. It doesn't need to be detailed, so you don't need the optionality and things like that in it. You can easily describe the optionality limitations using labels, such as we've got here with the ND label on a must detail relationship, which again is just a simple case of double clicking the line and entering it in. And then just talking about lines again, be mindful, and again, my opinion on this is that the lines should not overlap, because it in a way risks misleading the viewer. So where we've got a one-to-many in one direction and a one-to-many in the opposite direction, overlapping those lines may then look like it's a many-to-many when it isn't actually. Whereas separating those two lines out and using the smart connection points means that there's no confusion. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And it honors that snapping nature. So if you move the shape, it still retains the connection points.
Exactly. Okay. Maybe just a quick note. So what you can see here is, in this diagram, the lines are just crossing. If you want to make it a little bit simpler, go to the document settings, click for lines, and show line jumps so that you can really differentiate that. Okay. One other important aspect, what I think would really make sense, is if you arrange your diagram again in like sectors or business domains or use cases, because it helps your storytelling. So what you can see here in the central area, we have the account, the context of who actually, what constitutes my customer. What are some of the relational objects that form the extended customer master data, such as the account to account relationship, account contact roles, any kind of custom objects that are extending the customer master data. And then going in clockwise direction of actually representing the different entities. So here it's relatively straightforward. Top right corner or sector, we have marketing or any kind of prospect management objects. On the bottom right, we have the entire sales process, quotation, and contractual aspects before transitioning into the Service Cloud process. Now, that is a pretty straightforward, out-of-the-box Salesforce data model, and that was really the intention, because we didn't want to make it more complicated. But this could be very well also like maintenance. There could be project management aspects of what actually happens after you've sold the project, and you could arrange this in so-called sectors as well, just making your life easier and making it easier for the judges to follow. One important aspect is really the caution here is on purpose. First of all, this might include mistakes, so not every, please validate those data models that we're using here, validate every data model that somebody else is putting in front of you. You want to rely on the official documentation, okay? And again, this is a very large data model. Probably half of the number of objects is what you will face in the exam, but definitely the multitude of these objects. And last but not least, again, you can see here, one of the lines is a little bit clunky. I wouldn't bother with that till the very end when I'm cleaning up. I click reset line, and I modify this relatively quickly. Okay, so make your life easy.
There's another one about lines, actually. I talked about overlapping lines because you lose fidelity and clarity that way. But crossing lines is absolutely fine, as as Seb showed, with line jumps or whatever. Even if you don't have line jumps, it's okay for lines to cross, because it's about how you're describing that with the narrative that's important. Don't let perfectionism get in the way of clarity. Okay, so having straight lines or elbowed lines or curved lines
Mm.
versus not them crossing, not
Yeah.
crossing. Don't get too hung up on it. It's again just coming back to that point about these artifacts are there to
Mhm.
help you explain.
Yeah.
They're not there as the purest definition of your solution. Okay, so if they are not absolutely perfect, then it's okay, because you're going to describe the impacts of
Mhm.
some of the choices rather than describing the fact that this line goes from here to
Mhm.
here. That's not what they want to hear. Okay, that's not what they're
Yeah.
interested in.
Okay, cool. And maybe the last thing is where do you actually, from where to present those diagrams? So I sometimes see people taking screenshots of the diagrams and kind of moving it into their presentation. Now, I would like to make the case against it and would like to suggest presenting directly out of Lucidchart, because imagine you're actually giving a presentation and you're realizing, oh, I forgot the relationship between from the service contract to the account. You can relatively easy just fix that during your presentation, and any kind of changes you see directly in your eye or in front of your eyes, instead of having to remember, oh, what were the changes that I have made to the data model. Here it's a relatively simple one. We've introduced a new object, but maybe you also need to have like a service contract, asset relationship object. I don't really necessarily care so much about the way how this looks, but I just want to have that information right in front of me, so that I can easily refer back to this as I'm going to go through QA. So don't hesitate to make changes to your diagrams. Okay. Sam, we had one question here in the chat, which was, is it expected to have all L1 to L4 diagrams? I, I have to say, I have no clue what an L4 diagram is.
So I think this is a reflection also on the Salesforce diagramming framework, where you've got the big
Mhm.
picture and then you've got the next level down. You end up with a double click at the lowest level. Look, I'll say it again, and please take this as a mantra takeaway, for all future considerations when it comes to diagrams. Is it expected to have all diagrams? It is not a tick box exercise.
Yeah.
Okay. So you use the diagrams that help you articulate your solution, whichever that is. If it's L1, L2, and that's it. As long as you can then clearly explain the detail, without an artifact, it's absolutely
Yeah.
fine. If you will always need the bigger picture, however, because as I mentioned at the very beginning around storytelling, you need to frame and bridge between the various different domains and concerns of the change and transformation that the customer is going through. Okay, if you don't bridge it, it will be very difficult to
Yeah.
follow, and also very difficult to explain. You'll miss out. You'll have gaps in your
Okay,
solution.
cool. So, Sam, we will probably have to blaze a little bit quicker through. We have 17 minutes left on the clock, and
Sure.
we have 4 more or bigger diagrams waiting for us. So, let's look into the diagram,
Yeah.
or the diagram for data migration. So, first of all, having a diagram for data migration fundamentally is not a necessity, but I think it can be very helpful to visually depict this rather complex process. What you also need to be very mindful of is the dislike of the judges when they have the impression that you've simply memorized something. So you need to be very mindful of how you're customizing your data migration strategy to the specific needs of the scenario, in a sense of what are different systems from where the data originates from? What's the actual data that you're bringing in? What is your approach of loading that data? Are we talking about the full load? Do you do a delta load? Do you do a phased load? And if so, what are the phases you're going through? The same thing is true for your transformation aspect. So what are the actual transformations that you're going to do to your data? Are you going to consolidate customer records with spreadsheet records, one coming from the ERP, the other one coming from a SharePoint? So what's your process of enriching and merging that kind of data? Same thing is for deduplication. What are the actual criteria based on which you're going to dedupe the data? Is really where you can showcase that you have customized your strategy to the requirements of the scenario. So please don't fall short and just try to go in with a standardized template, because you will definitely pay the price in QA, where they will go quite in detail and quite extensively if they have the feeling that this is too generic. Yeah. Some questions on, or like, what are your thoughts on the data migration here?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you said there. You know, the templated approach, I mean, you know, it might give you a guide about what you want to talk through, and therefore what is important that you want to bring out in your artifact. But every scenario is different. In the same way as you you start a new project, they're going to have a completely different way of handling data, where is it stored, and and how they actually execute the migration. So treat it that way. And sometimes I would probably also add in here who is actually doing this work as well.
Exactly. So who will be responsible? Who's going to govern the data? Who's going to load the data in? It's definitely important aspects. Okay. And just have a quick look. No questions on the data migration. I think this is going to be relatively straightforward. As a general guidance, use the system landscape as well as the EAD to kind of check, okay, what are the systems from which I have to bring in data, and your EAD of what's the actual data that will be required to be present in my system right from the get-go. So where do I need to do data migration? Okay. Now, coming to everybody's favorite topic, environment and tooling. So, Sam, what's your take on this one?
Well, there's loads of different approaches, right? And even so in terms of layout, what are the concerns? This artifact sort of outlines what those are. Okay, but again, it's specific to the scenario. So what isn't covered on here is okay, what if you've got technologies with parallel dev teams? Okay, how are you going to manage the versioning of code in the environments if they have limitations on number of dev environments or testing environments or whatever? But it still provides a framework that you can use to articulate where the overlaps are. What are the potential pinch points or bottlenecks in the technical change process that you need to bring out as a risk.
Okay, cool. I had a conversation yesterday with somebody who was telling me, oh, I'm going for the board next week and I'm putting all my eggs into in Copado. And I was like, this sounds like a pretty bad strategy, because at the end of the day, you are selecting a tool that will help you or aid the process. But as an architect, and especially as a certified technical architect, you are supposed to explain how this tool will actually work. How will it not only help you facilitate the process, but fundamentally, how will it conceptually work? Is Copado going to, what's the branching strategy that Copado will use? How are you actually migrating changes between the different environments? How do you bring hot fixes back into your development stream? Those are the kind of questions that you need to be prepared to answer, regardless of the tool that you're suggesting here. So it's not going to be good enough to just treat this as a black box. The other thing is tooling in general. Now, you are expected to talk about what is the tooling strategy, what are different tools that you will be utilizing in order to support the development process and the delivery. And I would suggest to study or pick one product for each of those different tooling aspects that we have listed here and learn it. You don't need to know 50 different code analysis tools. You don't need to know Postman and 5 other products for how to handle mock services. But pick one, learn it, and be able to explain how you will utilize it and how this will aid the process and how this specifically links back to the requirements. Yeah. Cool.
Testing.
Yeah, testing. When we created this diagram, what we had actually done is we had a look into I think 20, 30 different solution presentations, and in particular, like how people had represented this particular diagram. And the funny thing is, not only did we have approximately 20 different variations of how this could be depicted visually, as well as how tests could be named, plus where tests could be located, which is why we had said, hey, listen, we are not going to tell you exactly where to run which tests or how to actually label those tests, because you might use different terms within your daily practice or within your work. So actually go in, identify what are the different tests that make the most sense within your practical experience and where you're running those, and then assign them to the respective environments and stay consistent. Instead of us just telling you here are the tests and you just memorize them. Okay, cool. Sam, anything you would like to add on this one?
Nope.
No? Okay, then
We covered it.
we're ready to jump into governance. Yeah, let's do this.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Sam, what are you thinking?
My favorite topic.
I know, that's why I let you present this.
So much like the previous ones, we've done here is we've picked out some of the typical authorities that are involved in your governance strategy, and there is absolutely a consideration here for your org strategy at the very beginning, which you would also cover whilst talking through your system landscape. But this isn't, again, this is not a this is how it should look. This is not a this is what needs to be included, because it's going to be specific to the scenario. For example, if you go with a single org strategy, you might have something that looks a little bit like this. There may be some additional boards depending on how the company or how the teams are structured, whether they have their own sort of QA functions or how many projects you're going to actually be running together. That may change this structure. You may also necessarily change this structure based on your org strategy. So a typical example of where you have a multi-org is where you've got multiple divisions with multiple lines of service that don't overlap significantly. Now, in that situation, it's highly likely that they're operating with some degree of autonomy, and therefore will have their own sort of steer codes individually that sort of feed into an overall governing board. So this diagram in that case looks very different. You'd have pillars of capabilities, each providing localized governance that then roll up either divisionally, regionally, or whatever it is. So again, use this framework as a guide, and really think about, okay, well, what are the concerns and how am I going to describe that using elements of this framework to fit the scenario?
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're bringing up a really good point once again. Absolutely avoid just going with like a standardized templated approach, and don't fall short of linking this back to the requirements. Do you have an SVP of customer success? Like how do they actually influence and how do you incorporate them into the governance of this project? Do you have existing development teams? Like how do they fit in here? What's your program structure? Do you have like one large program? Do you have like a portfolio of programs that run in parallel that need to be coordinated? How do you communicate across those different silos of those different programs? I think we could spend like probably a day just talking about this governance model, and I think yes, I know, I was about to say, and I'm pretty sure like if we were, if I wasn't now to suggest we move on, we would probably do that. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, wonderful. Now, last but not least, single sign-on. Again, everybody's favorite topic. So first of all, if you want to learn single sign-on flows, Lawrence has created like an incredible resource, cloudsundial.com, where you can find in-depth representations, explanations, and diagrams for the single sign-on flows. However, what we have decided is we have tried to identify what's the bare minimum that you should include in those diagrams to convey the story without getting lost in details. Now, a lot of the details that we have left out here, for instance, what are the exact responses that are exchanged? How do you communicate the relay state across different instances? Is left out because our suggestion would be to verbally articulate this as you're going through the diagram. Okay. The other thing is, don't just pick a random one, okay, but really pick a diagram and a sequence that is present in the scenario. Now, the one that you can see here is an OAuth SAML flow, where you're combining OAuth plus a SAML assertion, because we found this one to be one of the most complicated ones. But again, go back to the scenario and pick the ones that are relevant. Now, as for how to create them, what we are suggesting is to start with the labels, like the header, browser, client, web server, etc., and not having those swim lanes, not having those activation lanes, but simply going through so kind of going through the different sequences and just sizing the arrows accordingly to make it easier for you. Okay, and only in the very end, you actually start going in by adding those, because what happens, what you can see in a second here, is as soon as you start introducing those lines, if you have a smart connector, your arrows will connect automatically. No? See, reset line comes always very handy. As soon as you start connecting them, if you start trying to move something around because you made a mistake, it becomes very clumsy. So really just use the lines in the beginning, don't use the lifelines, don't use the activation ones, and simply at the very end, put them on top so that you can really fully depict the diagrams. That would be the general recommendation here. Okay. And with 3 minutes on the clock, I think that really gets us to the end of the diagrams that we wanted to talk about. Now is your opportunity to ask any kind of questions that are still pressing for you. Sam and me are still here. But from my side, I don't really have much else to talk. Sam, what are we missing from your point?
I think we talked about icons in
Yeah.
the system landscape. I was just going back over some of the
Mhm.
points. Yeah, so if you are using Salesforce diagrams cards, just be mindful that the icons are not mandatory. Again, if you can use them, by all means, drop them in there.
Mhm.
But there's a lot of those,
Mhm.
whether they be industry specific, platform
Mhm.
feature specific, and so on. And it's just going to take time
Mhm.
to produce. So going back to my previous
Mhm.
comment, don't let perfectionism get
Yeah.
in the way of clarity.
Mhm.
Okay, is it superfluous? Is it adding any
Yeah.
value to the artifact itself? I see we've got a question on the screen as
Yes.
well.
Do you want to take this?
Is the framework here to have an SSO diagram specifically, or to have something that represents authentication of some kind? Yeah. So Stuart, absolutely. I think it's mainly the latter, but if an SSO diagram helps that, by all means include it. Okay.
But it's definitely going to be single sign-on, or it's going to be
Yeah.
OAuth or multi-system single sign-on. But you're definitely not going
Yes.
to create like a diagram with a username and password authentication. Okay,
Mm.
cool.
That's another question. Are all the diagrams mandatory in CTA border? Can you skip a governance model? I go back to my previous comment.
Yeah.
So if you feel you can describe in enough detail the complexities and the
Mhm.
impacts and risks relating to the governance model without an
Mhm.
artifact, then first of all, kudos to
Yeah.
you. But
True.
but also, feel free to not
Yeah.
include one. I I personally would struggle, so I would need some form of
Yeah.
visual representation to be able to explain it. So yeah. I
Yeah.
would include one, but that's
I
me.
think in terms of the diagrams, the two that would be more optional than the others is migration and is governance. Um, if hard comes to hard and you're running out of time, you can also verbally walk them through the sequence diagram. But I also think it's a good signal to have such a sequence diagram ready to kind of demonstrate it. I think the perception that the judges have of you will just be slightly better. Okay, cool. Further questions, guys? Now is your opportunity. No? Okay. 3, 2, 1. I think we're done then. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you everyone for the joining. Great session, Sam and Sam. I
Thank
hope
you for
our
having us.
audience like it. So I will be
Mhm.
highly recommended if you like this session and
Yeah.
if you enjoyed it, go
Mhm.
to the social media and spread your love for our
Yeah.
speakers so that we can come back with the more great sessions.
Exactly. I mean, just a quick question. So you will be posting a blog post with the video as well as the links to the diagrams so that people can actually find it. Yeah.
Yep, it will be available on Apex Hour
Mhm.
blog post very soon,
Okay.
and video will be immediately available on YouTube, so you can
Mhm.
watch it just after the session again.
Mhm. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. Cool. I don't really have anything further. So Sam, I mean, are we going to stay on? Are the three of us going to drop off?
Yep, we all good. Thank you so